Great to see you all here. This is a very wonderful program that Kumar has put together. Uh, Let me ask you this question. In the last couple of days, how many, what you say, how many ideas have you heard that you think are completely bonkers? Couple. Which ones?
People are here.
Go ahead, go ahead.
So I think thinking of liberty from a blank slate, at least for countries which have a history like India, history of social discrimination, social injustice, whatever you
So
call it.
what's the bonker idea? Is the thinking about liberty for India?
No, not exactly. Thinking about liberties without thinking about the past history of
Oh,
India.
without the history.
In the
Okay.
current conditions, we have to think how
Sure,
can
sure.
we do better.
Okay, anybody else? None. No idea that you found completely ridiculous. How could? Go ahead.
Like some part of it, but probably not.
Which one? Which one?
It's all about perspective.
By now, you should have the enough courage to speak out. Right? Go ahead. Which even partly that you thought was bonkers. You want to challenge any of the people present in the room?
Go in the other room.
Yeah, I know. You all had to leave the class. That's I find very surprising. No idea that you found that sounded really off. That how could this possibly be true? How can somebody argue for such a thing?
So when we say bonkers, do we mean that we disagree with it essentially?
Or you thought it's a ridiculous idea, meaning it's just completely out of the something you would not even consider as valid or legitimate or worth.
Oh, like a bad idea.
Hmm?
So bad idea, not something that you opened your eyes to, but previously without.
Either way, either way. Bonkers could also mean that you suddenly, oh, you agree with it. But you thought it's bonkers, but still now you found that you are in agreement with it. Yeah.
So the other day in Brian's class, he was talking about something. In order to like avoid traffic in India, you could implement something like a congestion tax for people. And I just did not understand how is that going to, how would that help? I mean, I also had a conversation with him about it, but
Okay.
I still don't.
So
have a
congestion
clear
tax to
perspective on
reduce
it.
traffic
Yes,
challenge in
I
India.
still don't have. I mean, how would that
Okay. Yeah.
But Chris basically made the case against interest rate setting, inflation targeting, basically why have central banks attached to you.
Abolishing central bank.
I mean, pretty much.
You made a case for free banking?
Yeah, but you can ask.
Arrived at it, but didn't
Right.
talk about it.
Okay, okay. So made a case against central banking, but not for free banking. Good. So that was a pretty radical idea. The abolish central bank. Okay. Yeah.
Not in a talk, but in a casual talk. Hi, Kumar.
Okay, that's good. You pick one by one.
We were discussing how dancing in front of a camera is not necessarily worse than engineering from a humanities perspective for progress, and we were discussing that. So he doesn't think it's they're not on a. He thinks it's on the same spectrum. So I tend to disagree with that. But
So the idea is that dancing in front of a camera is the same thing as being an engineer.
that's what he thinks.
That's
So we're discussing basically subjective value, right?
okay.
For me, if I put much more value on dancing, maybe I
Okay.
want to go to engineering school and I want to do dancing.
Oh, the personal preference and
Right. So
But from
his point being that there is an objectively something better about being an engineer than dancing in front of camera, which I disagree with.
Okay.
Yeah.
that's the real point.
You agree with that? Yeah.
There is objective value and objective morality, something to pursue. As in, we tend to discard these subjects, saying these things are subjective, like subjective morality. You can't pursue for one goal in these things, but probably it's not say that we're objectively moral than people who were 300 years ago. There's some convergence to be done even still.
So you think you found the idea of subjectivism sort of.
As a way to discard these topics,
But this is subjectivism is this. I think subjectivism is not about morality.
no, we were talking about objective morality.
Okay.
Yeah, Mohit mentioned he floated the idea that while it's hard, it may be a good idea to also include unpaid labor in GDP measures, and that's something that I still haven't wrapped my head around. I'm not sure if.
Oh, unpaid labor like the household work.
Yeah.
Brian spoke about the hold-up problem in some sense, and regulations help people to sort of sit on the property and prevent more construction. I felt like there were a lot of layers missing, and even if there is a hold-up, I would be worried to have someone say that there are 20 buildings and this bird doesn't matter as much, and we should take the bird nest out or leave the bird nest. So local contexts matter, and it felt like a very bird's eye economist's view that this is the right thing to do and this efficient, without really fully understanding how things change.
I mean the zoning laws and how zoning laws prevent.
So the very specific instance that I keep thinking about what he said was there were 20 houses that could be built. 3 people were unhappy about light pollution, and so there were 17 houses and 3 fewer, and it's some kind of hold up and not the best way to go about it.
I don't know. Could I just elaborate on what they were saying? I think.
No. If you have other idea, then add to the list that you think are
No, I just don't think that those ideas were as
radical as.
radical.
So Brian Kaplan argued about open borders. Was that a radical idea?
Not for us.
No?
Yeah.
So you are all in agreement with open borders.
I mean, he did ask us that, is it okay for you guys to get like Sri Lankans, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis in India? What do you think about that?
And what did you guys think about it?
We guys were like silent.
Bangladesh. So are you guys okay with having Bangladeshis come in?
Yeah, there was this
Yeah?
silence.
Okay, who is in favor of Bangladeshis coming in without any limit? No.
Only one Bangladeshi with no daily land.
Are you really Bangladeshi?
Yes, sir.
Huh?
Came all the way from Dhaka.
Okay. So when I was thinking about this topic, I thought that by the time you would find this very light material, so you heard so many more radical ideas, thinking about market failure, what do you look like? No, we already understand the market doesn't really fail, right? Which is what you have been hearing for the last 2.5 days. So I thought maybe it's an easy thing for you to do. I'm quickly going to go through it because this is very commonly used argument across sort of domain. Of course, in economics for sure, but of course, these terms are now very commonly used across fields, political science, right? So it's important to understand this sort of Austrian perspective or a market perspective on market failure, right? Are you guys all familiar with these 4 terms? Yeah? Okay, before we start, let's define the market. What's the market? Before market fail, we need to know what the market is, right? Place of exchange, where exchange happens. What else? Are there any prerequisite or requirement for market to work well?
Double coincidence of bonds.
Yes.
It has to be voluntary.
It's a voluntary, yes. All transactions are voluntary.
Consensus of the medium of exchange.
You don't have to have consensus, but we know, I'm sure, evolves in a way that people begin to accept more widely.
Existence of private property.
Right? Private property. So you need to have property rights being defined well, right? So unless you have property rights being defined some way or the other, right? And also it means also being enforced in some form or the other. Could be formal structure, could be informal ways of enforcing it, right? But property rights have to be clear. I should know what's mine before I can exchange with you with what's yours, right? So what's mine and what's yours has to be clear, right? What's the other thing that needs to be there for market to work well? Competition, yeah, right? You need some competition. Third is the price system. The market depends on the prices being able to move around, change as per supply and demand, right? So if prices are not allowed to move and reflect supply and demand, then of course market would not work in that case, right? And the third, which is sometimes we don't think about, is the profit and loss system, right? So markets work well when it is clear that if you don't do the right thing, you lose money and thereby may go out of business, right? So if that discipline is somehow taken away, then again you would see market would not work well, right? So three clear areas where you need some way of defining markets, right? Some parameters of market. Unless those parameters are being met, you would not expect market to work well. So one is definition of property rights, some way of enforcing property rights. Second, freely fluctuating price system. Prices can respond to supply and demand. And third is profit and loss discipline, right? If that discipline goes away, again, market would not work. Now you can think about examples in each of these categories, right? And see when sometimes we think markets are not working. The reason why they are not working because one of the three things are not being met.
Could there be a fourth thing like free entry and exit? Like you don't want to participate in the market, you just and free entry and free exit basically.
Yeah.
And if you want to become a seller, you can.
So you can put more items on the list, right?
Okay.
Competition is the other one we talked about. But these are the three that seems like a very foundational. Rest would sort of, our implications would follow unless there's somebody interfering in creating, stopping you from exiting the market, right? But yeah, it will be one of the requirements in some sense. The last one is very important, the profit and loss discipline, right? One reason why the banking system does not work, right? And most people think that's a market failure, right? The financial crisis that we see, right, is largely because there is no profit and loss discipline on the banks, right? We now have a too big to fail argument, right? So whenever there is a financial crisis, the banks are getting bailed out, right? Hardly anyone goes under. Right? So what we have done in the banking system is that we put the banks out of the market discipline of profit and loss. So when they make profit, profits are theirs. When they are going to make huge losses, they will get bailed out.
IBC still works for banks? IBC would still work for banks?
So theoretically, yes, everything works for the banks, right? But in practice, we don't allow banks to go under, right? Of course, larger reason for that is that contagion effect, that if you allow one bank to go under, it will spread to other banks and whole banking system would come in danger. Yeah.
Just the three things that essentially we counted: profit and loss discipline. Do you think it's a subset of price system? Because if there is no profit and loss discipline, what essentially we are saying is that the price system we're not allowing it to function. Like there is price distortion.
Let's take a banking example. What's the price distortion there? When you say too big to fail, what prices are we distorting?
If the banks are too big to fail.
Yeah. But that's the right? That's the argument which is being offered for not allowing banks to go under.
Right. We are basically not letting, if it's not failing, then what's happening is people who have, like there are a lot of prices that are linked just to that bank, right? Like I mean, in terms of people who are saving there, people who are borrowing money from that bank and all of that stuff. There is, so essentially there is price distortion there.
Okay. It's not, you can see there are two different things. Yeah.
I mean, if we are bailing out bank, we are essentially distorting price of pretty much everything because in the end, people borrow money from the bank and they go and buy things. And if you are allowing banks to just give money more easily, then people are going to buy things that they may not need.
Yeah, Mohit.
Of course, there are many interest rates. So
Yeah.
There's not one price. But if you look at the central fixing price, that all flows from the central banks, interbank lending, and that's fixed. So you actually have price setting by the central bank of the most important price in an economy, which is the price of borrowing money.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest distortion There's no free market in a sense. So that central price of money, which is the interest rate set by the central bank.
Yeah. But so you can have a central price being fixed and still you can allow banks to fail. So the two arguments about no, what is linked, whether they are linked to each other or not, right? So you can restrict the have a single interest rate being defined by the central bank, and you can still allow private banks to fail if they are insolvent.
If the banks know they cannot fail, then
Oh.
they make loans they have no business making. And
Yeah,
people
yeah.
who have no so
Which is the argument, yeah.
right. But that's
Right.
discretionary.
Yeah, which is different, yeah. They're making loans which are not going to be as sound, right? So I just want to highlight the fact that there are some prerequisites for markets to work well, right? And therefore you have to understand what those are before we say where markets fail, right? So I think that's the important point of the. Okay, let's start with the first one, public goods. I think all of you know what public goods are. Anybody can define?
The use of which by one person does not exclude another person.
So non-rival consumption, right? What is the other one?
Non-rivalrous, non-excludable. So she said non-excludable, non-rivalrous.
Can somebody
she said non-rivalrous.
just explain both terms because not everybody may not know that.
So if I am using it, my use of it is not affecting your use of it. So both of us can use it, and it the same resource. So that's non-rivalrous. Non-excludable is that I cannot exclude you even if I want to. If I created this resource in the first place, it's very difficult to exclude you. That's non-excludable.
And one example.
If there is Delhi police, for example, right, and if I've created a police, it's difficult to exclude, that hey, this group of people will not get the service of the police, or this road, again, technically, you can exclude by putting a toll, but otherwise, it's somewhat non-excludable.
Is that clear? No. Anybody have an example of public good?
Clean air.
Clean air is a public good.
Like army, like national army.
National defense, right? Which is a classic example people use as a public good. How is that public good? You can explain how does it meet the two requirements?
Because it is non-rival, because if Indian borders are protected, then all the citizens who are living within India, they are protected. And it is non-excludable because like how can you then like unless you throw someone out of the country, you cannot really exclude them from the national defense.
So why is market supposed to fail
I mean, yeah,
in producing public good? So once you understand what a public good is, you can see why a market is not expected to produce public goods, right? Which is the argument for market failure.
The free rider problem.
What happens?
Everyone doesn't pay for the public good. Some people just use the public good without paying for it.
Right? Take the example national defense. It's very hard to exclude people who have not paid their taxes, say for example, right? So you're financing national defense by taxing people. It's hard to say that these guys have not paid taxes, therefore we would not provide them national defense, right? By nature is that everybody would be protected in a given area, right? And therefore, market would not produce something like that because it's hard to charge people, right? Because everybody knows that once it is produced, we all can benefit by it, right? Once somehow the defense gets produced, then we all would benefit by the national defense, even if we have not paid for it, right? And if somebody were to come to you to ask you for a payment for national defense, you can easily refuse that payment, right? So in theory, market would not produce such goods which are public goods, right? And okay, this is a public good. And I think in most cases, one thing to understand, I think this is a very common mistake people make, right? So most people argue that education, health are all public goods, right? Are they public goods? Why aren't they public goods? Yeah.
I mean, even if public funds for it, let's say education, and maybe I reach to the class late, teacher can exclude me. They can say, no, you get out of the class. So technically, I'm being excluded. So it is very easy to exclude, and people do get excluded, even if it's mandatory and compulsory for everyone. I mean, same applies for healthcare. Let us say a government hospital is overburdened by patient on a certain day. A doctor will have certain capacity, so a lot of people will be excluded from it. So,
It is possible.
yeah, it is possible.
I think so. The first thing, the first caveat is that the whole public good, private good, that distinction, it's more of a spectrum. And education is both rivalrous and excludable. We can exclude, like, nobody can, I can say that, there will only be these people in this classroom and all of that. And
No, if you imagine 100 people sitting here, right, it will be rivalrous. All of you cannot really enjoy education the same way. And of course, excludable because I can close the door.
absolutely.
And
Healthcare is also obviously rivalrous and excludable because my cancer treatment, means that there is someone who's not getting that. And the other thing with healthcare is that some of public health, let's say that some preventive measures can be considered public good because
for example,
epidemic prevention things. If there is measures against COVID,
like vaccination.
If vaccination, right? If you are vaccinated and you're roaming around, there are other people who have a positive externality. They're not getting COVID because you're vaccinated.
Yeah.
So things like that.
They're not non-rivalrous because there are limited number of hospital beds and limited number of college seats or the limited number of seats are limited number of beds.
Yeah.
So that what Akash just mentioned seems like an externality. It's not necessarily, and you can exclude people from getting the vaccine.
No, you can't exclude people from the. I can't exclude you from my benefit of taking the.
Yes, that's right. So that's a positive externality. It's not that vaccination becomes a public good, according to me, because
It doesn't become a public good. It's just more on that spectrum. It's still not a public good, if that makes any sense. Anything which I think has very high positive externality for the whole public is slightly more of a public good. I mean, if I'm not
Yeah.
Biotechnology education also imposes a lot of
there is a lot of statistical study which says that your education actually is, does not, it's not that high of a positive externality as people make it out to be.
It also varies in terms of the level of education. So studies show that primary education has a stronger positive externality than the higher education. In the case of higher education, the benefits of acquiring higher education accrue mostly to you, to the individual who get higher education, not to larger society. While the benefits of acquiring primary education accrue as much to you as an individual as to the larger society, right? So that is where the argument about positive externality for primary education, which is being made. But it's not, it can still make a case for primary education to be subsidized or whichever way you want to argue, right? But it's not a public good. I think what you want to understand is that public good is not something good for the public or what I think is good for the public, right? Which is how most people think, which is why I think most of these are usually cited as examples of public good because education obviously is good for public. Healthcare is good for public, right? Public park obviously by definition are public because the name says public park, right? Yeah. Hmm?
Public park could be a common good, but maybe not essentially public.
Common access resource, you mean? Yeah. But not a public good in the way we define public good, right? And the reason why definition is important is not because we want to be too picky about it, but so it's important because those are the goods which market would not produce in theory, right? That's the argument. And therefore, what I want to show you, which is what I, with the title, that many public goods are actually produced by the market. And not just produced as a non-profit entity by the market, but also as a for-profit business, right? And some examples which don't appear as public goods are really the good examples of public goods, right? Usually we use national defense as an example, but radio is also a public good. How is radio public good? So once you produce radio signals and you broadcast them, anybody who has a radio set, right, would be able to listen to it. You cannot say that only those who are paid for my service would only be able to listen to it, right? So radio broadcast is a public good. And so is a TV broadcast, right? Once you produce a TV program, and broadcast them, which is old days before cable TV, right? Anybody who has a TV set would be able to receive. Of course, you've seen the movies where you have to adjust the antenna to get the signal, right? And so anybody who has a TV with the proper antenna would be able to receive your signal, right? You cannot exclude people from tuning in or using your programming, even if they have not paid for it, right? Which is why, in theory, these are the goods which market would not produce, right? But market, as you know, produces them. How does markets produce them? How do people make money by producing radio programs and TV programs? So what is the market doing?
The excludable thing is the airtime instead of who listens.
Excludable thing?
Is the airtime for the advertiser rather than who gets to listen.
Or combining? Go ahead. They're combining two public goods. One is the programming, and second is the ad, right? They're combining the two in a way that you have to consume the package. You don't pay for the programming, obviously, it's just for free, but you pay for the advertising, right? So the market figured out a way of combining public goods together as a package. For one is unpaid, second one is paid, and you're able to charge high enough price, assuming to be able to cover your cost of programming, right? As well as, of course, broadcasting the program. So the advertising covers the cost of producing the program, right? And combining the two things, the same thing about radio, right? So something that people would have thought for a long time. What's interesting about this is that if you look at the textbooks in UK, you will find radio and TV as commonly cited examples of public good. But if you look at the textbooks in US, you will never find radio and TV as an example of public good. Why is that?
UK really forces you to buy license for BBC. Like
Yeah.
if you buy a TV in UK, you would have to pay money to BBC. There is absolutely no way you can get out of it.
Right? The BBC is a national service, and actually you have to pay tax when you buy a TV unit, right?
They always find you. Like all my friends in UK say, there's just absolutely no way to get away from it. They find you. Even if you get a TV from outside, they find you that you're using
Oh.
this, and they tax you.
Oh, they come into the house and check.
No, they send a letter.
How do they know?
I have no idea. They track TV sales or something. Yeah.
You need to pay an annual TV license fee.
Yeah.
I can use Netflix on the
No.
If you want a TV, you need to pay an annual TV
If
license.
you don't have a TV, you don't have to pay. But even if you import a TV, they just know that you have a TV. And they come and send you a...
So in UK, it's very common for people to think that they are produced by the government, right? BBC produces TV programs and radio programs, and therefore, and they are paying a tax for it also. So mentally, they are thinking that anything produced by the government is a public good, right? Which is the other way in which people go wrong in thinking about public good, right? Other example. No. Lighthouses. This is, of course, classic example for which Coase wrote a very famous article, right? So lighthouses usually are also seen as a public good. How are the public goods? How are they lighthouses non-excludable, non-rival?
The lighthouse is sort of benefiting everyone in the periphery of the place of the house.
So once you send the light beam on the water, everyone in the area would be able to see the light beam. You can't exclude people who are not willing to pay for it, right? Therefore, it's impossible for a market to produce lighthouse services. Right? You can't charge for the service, right? But there are examples, as Coase documented in his article, of privately built lighthouses. How do they do it? How are they making money in producing something which is public good? Charge for the docking, right? So lighthouse services are free, but if you want to dock at the marina, you have to pay a docking fee, right? Or you want to unload goods, or you have to pay a fee for that, right? So I'm producing two things together, the docking service or marina service plus lighthouse. Lighthouse is free, it's a public good. I can't charge for the lighthouse service. I'm charging for something else, yeah.
But how do you answer the point that yes, it's getting produced,
less than optimum. Because if we could charge for the light service also, then we would get the optimal number of lighthouses. In some sense, we are getting some lighthouses, but not as many as would be socially optimal. How do you address that question?
Good point. How do you address it?
Very simple, actually.
Yeah.
Quite simple. Because if all the lighthouses are built by people who charge for dock, if there are not enough docks, the price of docking will go up and somebody else will build another dock. It's the same as television channels, right? You make money by the advertising. The lighthouse is like an advertising for the dock, just as the advertising pays for the television program. No different. Look at central terms.
So the price, the profit loss would, if somebody is making unusual profits in docking services, then obviously there'll be more docking services being produced. Though I don't know if that answers your, but I think that depends on how you define what is optimal.
I'd like to give
Yeah.
one more point, which is that a lot of discussion around free markets and so on and so forth ignores one basic instinct of humanity, which is philanthropy. And philanthropy is a very powerful force. Whether we look at universities, libraries,
And even lighthouses.
as what happened to lighthouses.
Yes, many of them
If
were.
they're a dangerous place, communities will come in, or rich people.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, we keep saying we can't think the state is benevolent, but we want to keep saying individuals are benevolent and will give philanthropic
No, I'm just saying that it's not necessary for the model, and I described it without that, but I'm saying philanthropy is a powerful force. If we're realistic and look around us, I come from theatre. All the good theatres in Delhi are built by private individuals, not by the state. You look at the 10 top universities in the world, not one of them is a government university. You can continue that example ad infinitum. So don't ignore a very powerful force in the state.
Also, between philanthropy and state, the point is not about benevolence. It's about whose money are they spending on whose on whose behalf. So if they're using by coercion my money to be benevolent, I would much rather be benevolent myself, which is the big problem with CSR. Right? You're taking money or forcing people to do benevolence. Right?
To Vikram's
Yeah.
point, it's like, does it just mean that if there's no docking money to be made for whatever reason, that place will not have a lighthouse? That's the inefficiency. Like if for some reason, let's say they don't own the land around or whatever, and there should be a lighthouse in that place, and there's somehow no docking money to be made, then that lighthouse will not exist. So isn't that the problem?
If there's a need for it, how would you be able to make the money? Just think through it.
If the lighthouse is needed and you can't charge docking fees for whatever reason, then you have to find. I mean, you may have to find something else. Maybe someone will, maybe someone won't, but maybe that lighthouse doesn't exist, but it would have been better off for everyone.
Yeah, yeah. So think about who is suffering because there is no lighthouse in that area. Right? So who would have an interest in putting up a lighthouse? Yeah, it is. Some of them do. Some of them do make. Yeah. Yeah. So some of the lighthouses did come about, right, by the association of companies, right? Because we know that we are the ones suffering because of this rocky area, and that they will get together because there few companies are using that route more often than the others, right? So there are multiple ways, which is what I think Mohit was trying to say, including philanthropy, right? Multiple ways in which one can see how this problem gets solved through the voluntary transactions, right? Most people think dams are public goods, but dams can also have been built by private entities for profit. How can you build a dam for profit?
Selling electricity to produce.
That's one way.
Private power generation.
But you have to be much higher. No, you have to earn a lot of money through electricity to be able to justify building a dam just for that. Right?
It also transforms that geography a lot.
Yeah, and how does that benefit? Once you build a dam, there is some advantage that accrues which you can cash in. Hmm? Possible, tourism. But the value of land goes up, right? So if land used to get flooded every other year or so, you're able to build a dam on it, right? And then prevent flooding from happening, right? The value of land would go up, and difference between the land that was there before building the dam and after building the dam, that difference could be high enough to cover part of the dam cost, right? So there are various ways in one we can think about how even that can be built publicly, right? Or rather privately. So one classic example of market failure, you can see there are many public goods which are produced by the market itself, right? Not just as a non-profit entity, but also as for-profit business. Okay, the second one, externalities. There are positive and negative externalities, right? How do we define externality?
You impose a cost on someone who didn't consent, or you provide a benefit to someone who didn't pay.
A transaction between two parties has an effect on a third party, right? There's a third party. If the effect is negative, then it's negative externality. If the effect is positive, then it's a positive externality, right? And this is a classic example of market failure. And one key example of this is, okay, I'm just showing you how it's being described in the supply-demand diagram if you have been using it, right? So difference between private cost and the social cost, right?
How exactly are these externalities again market failures? Not understand.
How are the market failure?
Because the person getting affected is not getting compensated, or the person benefiting is not paying.
This is an oversupply.
That's one part, but what is it?
Is either an oversupply or an undersupply, because the true cost is not being accounted for.
Right. So if you only include the private cost, then this is how much you produce. Q market, which you see in the diagram, right? If you account for the total social cost, which is private plus external cost, right? Then this is what you would produce, which is the QE. Right? So you're overproducing things which have negative externality and underproducing things which have positive externality. Right? So that's the argument. Right? Classic example of this, of course, are environmental problems. Right? So almost all environmental problems are within this bucket. Right? I'm just going to show you 2 or 3 examples and then see how we can solve them without government involvement. Right? This is a problem. What kind of problem is this? Are you going to see what? Overfishing, right? Why does that happen?
Someone owns the water, the fishing rights.
Over the water. Endangered species, other problem, right? Air pollution. Another way of thinking about these problems is actually think about the tragedy of the commons, right? There are common resources involved in all of those examples. And since those are commonly owned, nobody has interest in taking care of it, right? Of course, as Ostrom showed, I don't know, you have discussed that earlier, that you could have properly managed common resources, common access resources. What then we are pointing out is that those which are collectively owned, right, where it is not clear who actually owns it. So as long as a community can own the resource, but it's clear which community actually owns it, then Ostrom shows how they will be able to take care of the common pool resource, right? But a resource which is collectively owned, meaning all of us own it. For example, say rivers of India, right? We all own it. Forests of India, we all own it. It's not clear which community owns. We all do, right? So wherever there's a collectively owned resource, you will find that problem of the tragedy of the collective. So I prefer calling it tragedy of the collective as a tragedy of the commons, because commons, we can argue that they can be managed properly by the communities themselves. Right? And to solve this problem, there are two ways of solving it. One is to either privatize or communitize the resource, or put a price on the use of the resource, right? So all of these problems that you see, environmental problems, you can solve by one of the two methods.
Is there a difference in how well privatization versus communitization functions in protecting or adequately using that resource properly?
I think most of the examples we have so far are usually communitized, right? There are very few examples of large-scale privatization, right? Let's take a couple of examples and maybe you see. So if you want to apply that solution here, you have to privatize or communitize the resource. What is the resource involved? Elephant or elephants living in a forest, right? So forest is the collective resource, right? So how do you privatize, communitize, or put a price on it, right? The two ways of solving the problem, yeah.
So one thing would be that if there is, let us say, a local community which lives nearby the forest, or maybe a tribal community in the forest, you could just let them manage the forest and maybe keep some incentives for them that, okay, if I want to, let's say I buy a ticket to visit the forest, then yeah, they will basically be paid.
So give somebody who is living around the area right to sell tickets to the forest entry.
Yeah,
Oh.
something like that.
Okay. Any?
Rights to hunt elephants, maybe. Create a private incentive to create more elephants. Yeah. You create a private incentive to have more elephants as a result.
Or so the poaching that happens, right? Usually poaching is not done by somebody from outside, right? The tigers and elephants which are being poached, the poaching is done by people living there only, right? They are the ones who know their movement and their habitat, right? It's not some guy from China is coming there to do tiger hunting to get the paws or right, tiger skin, right? There's somebody living there. You'd ask, why is that the case? Why are the people living around the forest areas have become the poachers?
Because they have no stake left in the forest, they have been excluded.
Yeah, right. What happens when you declare something as a reserved forest? We require that no human habitation should be allowed in that area, right? So everybody living in the area is actually forced to move out. And they have been dependent on the forest resource until that point in time. Now they've been forced to move out. They are going to come back and use the resource that they have been used to, right? And they are the ones who become then poachers in the forest, right? So by the way in which we do the protection of the forest, we are creating a system where the people living around the forest are actually enemies of the forest in a way, right? For them, forest is not something is helping them. The reserve forest is actually taking away their own livelihood, their own means of or ways of living that they have been used to, right? Turns out that I think in almost every case of environmental problem, there is a country which is not so well known finds a solution to the problem, right? In this case, there's one country in Africa that decided that they are not going to sign the treaty, which is a treaty called CITES, CITES. What is the full name? So this is actually how we are trying to protect the endangered species, right? Yeah.
International trade on the endangered species.
Yeah. Convention on, yeah, right? And that's a treaty that countries sign and that prevents trade in body parts of endangered species, right? You cannot trade tusk or tiger skin, right? And that's been a sort of effort through which we are trying to protect the endangered species, right? Zimbabwe was the one country that decided that they don't want to sign the treaty. They're going to give the forest to communities, right? So Pacific, about area of the forest given to Pacific tribal community, And in that case, it was completely given over to them to use whichever way they want to use it. Right? You can see most of the people were very concerned by this development because they thought the poor tribals, once you give them access to elephants and timber, what would they do? Right?
Cut down timber and kill the elephants.
Yeah, they would make a money for themselves. Right? Turns out that exactly opposite happened. For a long, long time, that was the only country in the world where the elephant population was increasing. Everywhere else it was declining, right? And interestingly, this is the only country where it was illegal to hunt elephant. For a long time, it's no longer now. For a long time, it was legal to hunt elephant in Zimbabwe. You can actually buy a license or a permit to hunt, right? This is a program that is called Campfire, started in 1989. Do you see this working anywhere else? No?
Pakistan. Yeah, they have for Marpur a similar program. So in Pakistan, it is actually so there is a very there is a giant goat called Marpur in Pakistan. So you are actually allowed to hunt that goat, but you need to take permit from the community and you need to pay certain money, like a large money to the community, and that way you can hunt the Marpur and yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, it has led to an increase in population of Marpur over time, and it has also produced wealth for the local communities.
How would that happen? Just ask yourself, how would population would increase when you are allowing legal hunting? So what would be happening in the forests of Zimbabwe, right?
No one wants to kill the golden goose.
They're killing them.
Yeah.
They kill older animals.
The propensity of the number of people who will be willing to pay to, for example, hunt some of these animals, I'm pretty sure that's not as large as it will overpower and overkill.
But whatever number there are, suppose there are 100 elephants when they gave the forest to the community,
No, you're
right?
incentivizing breeding. You incentivize breeding.
How do you incentivize elephants to breed? That's really what you have to do, right? So what do you have to do so they will breed more?
Because they have to see the long-term value, like they have to see, because if they become extinct, then they won't.
Elephants have to see the long-term value in breeding.
People have to see long-term value in
So the people do. But what do people do so the elephants would do what they want them to do?
You're in breeding season, you don't allow hunting.
Taking care of elephants. You take care of elephants. Help them, keep them healthy, encourage them to breed, do whatever it takes so that they're healthy and happy.
Healthy and happy.
Make roads on elephant corridors.
Set up elephant
So what is interesting about this, and that when I read about this case study, is that the tribals of Zimbabwe actually used to hire experts from around the world. They also realized that the traditional knowledge they had was quite limited in how to take care of the forest and how to take care of the elephant population. Of course, they had some idea. They've been living in those forests for generations, right? But they also realized that this is not enough. And so they used to hire experts from around the world to come there and advise them how to increase, how to manage the resources better, right? And they used to pay like World Bank consultancy rate, which is what I remember about the story, that the tribals of Zimbabwe are paying somebody World Bank consultancy rate to get them to come there and advise them how to manage the resource, right? So you can see how things change so dramatically from what we imagine that group of people to be, and being capable of doing, right? Suddenly you find that moment you give them this power, the resource in their hand, right? Things change so dramatically about how they behave and what they do, right? And this really is a powerful example of how empowering, in this case, obviously, the tribal community in Zimbabwe, you actually change the whole system, right? There are many places where we are trying, like the example you are using where people are given some benefit, right? But those are not really sustainable, right? Because there is no long-term stake, right? It's a short-term benefit the government is giving you, right? Often they are given a job. So of course, ecotourism is happening, hotels are getting constructed in the area, the locals get a job in those hotels, right? Uh, Again, it's not a long-term stake in the management of the resource, right? Resource still remains under the forest department control, right? So if you really want people to think long-term, you really have to give them a stake which is also long-term, right? Just giving some benefits here and there about ticket sales or a job is not going to make them align with the conservation of the resource, right? Yeah, which is what Zimbabwe did. Yeah, it's a long-term lease, right? But it is a lease on the resource as a whole, right? And you have to live with the consequences, in a sense, what the tribals would do with it. Yeah.
So why doesn't the fisherman think of this? Like they can also consult experts and maybe.
Yeah, and my next example is precisely that. See, so how do you now think about what we are trying to do, right? This is a collectively owned resource, which in this case is water, and therefore fish, right?
There's a question there.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, you said it ran for a while and elephant population was increasing. Do we know why it was stopped, the campaign?
No, it's not stopped, but they stopped allowing the hunting. Yeah. So I was saying that even when it was legal to hunt elephant in this case, population was still growing, unlike everywhere else in the world where it was illegal to hunt an elephant and population was declining, right? So contrast is what I was trying to. No, not the people themselves stopped doing it. They realized they can make enough money from the other resources, right? Oh, right. So many other resources became, and they also, in a sense, had a popular pressure to stop legal hunting, right? But I think what is important about the initial allowance of legal hunting is that that is how they can manage the transition, right? So if you are making a living by poaching elephants so far, suddenly, how do you make a living when you are no longer going to poach? Because now it's your own elephant in a way, right? And therefore, you need some way of earning quick money to get the community behind the idea, right? And there are many ways people are not, there's of course rhino bonds for rhinos in Northeast, right? There are ways in which people are giving money to communities upfront in order to protect because you need to have some way of earning a livelihood, right? Which is what you were used to do before, you have to stop doing it, right? And therefore, I think hunting was an important way in order to make the transition from the collective ownership of the resource of the forest to the community ownership of the forest. And that transition is usually difficult to do. And quite often the experiment fails, like in Nepal and other countries, largely because there is no funding for the transition. And therefore people start killing elephants and destroying the resource in the process of that transition, right? And the moment people see it, they stop the program because now they realize that tribals are not really protecting the forest or conserving forest, they're actually consuming the forest, right? So collectively owned resource is water, and therefore the fish population. If you catch a small fish in the current situation, you would not throw the small fish back in the water, right? So anybody like a fisherman catches small fish, they would not throw the small fish back in the water because they think even if I throw the small fish back in the water, somebody else may catch it, and they probably would not throw it back in the water, right? So the incentive for every fisherman is to collect as much as possible, including the fish which is not really of high value, small ones, right? And which is the reason for fish population depleting around the world, right? Which is a tragedy of the collective as we define it. Again, a solution to this problem like Zimbabwe, an odd country, again, one more odd country figured out how to solve this problem because their economy was dependent on fishing industry, right? So they really had a serious problem on their hand as the fish population began to decline, right? And they figured out this solution. So before we go there, let's talk about what we currently do. How are we currently protecting fish population, right? So we ban during reproductive season. What else?
You can only catch fish above a certain size. There are size limits.
Yeah. How do you enforce that you cannot catch small fish?
Net size.
Yeah. So you regulate the mesh size, right? The hole should be particular size so that small fish can escape. Only bigger ones than that size would be caught, right? That's a regulation that we have put in place. What else? To think about ways in which you can protect the fish population, right? Which is what governments are trying to do uh, through various regulations and restrictions. Yeah, limit the number of people who get a license to, right?
Limit what hours of the day you're allowed to fish.
Yeah, they also limit actually not just hours of day, but also limit the size of the boat that you can take on the water, right? And sometimes they also limit the size of the motor, power of the motor that you can put on the boat, right? So many different ways in which we are trying to control the overfishing problem. Obviously, you can see we have 3,000 kilometers of seal line, right? 300, no, 3,000. Coastline of India. 3,000, almost 3,000 kilometer coastline, right? And you can imagine how are you going to be enforce these rules, right? It's just impossible to enforce that.
7,500.
7,500?
7,500 kilometers.
So 3,000 only on one side.
Coastline.
I was talking about like 300 that miles, which comes in the territory of a country. Where
Oh,
international borders come.
nautical miles, yeah, for which you have, yeah, yeah.
So that comes to your territory.
Yeah, yeah. Yep. And the Iceland found this solution, which is called ITQ, individual tradable quota, right? So basically what the country did is to ask the fishing families about their last 3 years average catch. So what have you caught in the last 3 years on average, right? And basically that amount that they gave a piece of paper saying from now onwards, you have a legal right to catch X amount of fish from this area, right? And that became a legal entitlement or legal right to the proportion of fish in that area, right? So for example, simple example, 3 fishing families, right? One family used to catch say 500 tons of fish, second 1,000, and third other 500. Total amount of fish caught was 2,000 tons of fish in that area, right? So what government did is that give the first fishing family a right to collect 25% of the fish population in the area, because of course this 2,000 ton varies year after year, right? It's not a constant supply of fish every year, right? Sometimes it will be 2,000 tons, sometimes it will be 2,500, sometimes it will be 1,500. So for various natural reasons, the amount of fish in the area would vary, right? And therefore, government gave a proportion of the fish that exists, which is what they call total allowable catch. And surprising to me, it's easy to calculate the total allowable catch in the area. So this sonar techniques are such that you can calculate how much fish there is quantity-wise in the area. So government says this X number is the total allowable catch. Your legal right is to catch 25% of the fish, right, from the area, and similarly for the other fishing family. And the enforcement of this also done internally by the fishing families themselves, right? So each one knows how much right you have, therefore how much fish you can collect, and they have associations of various kinds to then enforce the legal entitlement. Yeah.
If I become a more efficient fisherman, I'm able to catch more efficiently than I historically could, doesn't this system sort of prevent me from doing that? if whatever reason I'm suddenly now a better fisherman? Doesn't this sort of make it more? I mean, pretty much.
No, the point is there's a shortage of fish. No, that's the
No,
problem
no.
we're trying to solve.
But it sort of makes sure I can't become more productive.
No, it will make
No.
sure that you.
So you can
Buy the
productive.
product.
What there are two components of being productive, right? Amount of effort you put in, and amount of catch you have. So catch remains fixed,
But I
right?
can work fewer hours a week.
Yeah. So that's being productive, and then you can play a music band, which is actually what happened in Iceland, which is a surprising thing, that after the ITQ came into place, there were a large number of music bands came about, right? And of course, it's very hard to see what the connection is between the two, but you can, once you think about it, you can see what the link is between the ITQ system and the music bands. Can you see what the, huh? What?
Desert island is exactly what happened. We had a music band. Yeah. Music band happened because there was more water. Exactly the same.
Huh?
The other remarkable thing is that the football team made it to the World Cup.
What's the link between music bands and ITQ? Quickly. No, because see, when in the customary system, one person of the family has to remain in the fishing business to continue to have the claim on the right to fish in the area, right? The moment nobody fishes from your family, you lose that right. So every one person in the family was required to be in the fishing business. Now, who would that be? Right? Male member of the family, right? So at least one male member would always remain in the fishing business, even though they may not want to. As the family size begin to decline, when you have 6, 7, 8 children, then of course one of them may be interested in becoming a fishing, right, person. But when you have 1 or 2 kids, then none of them want to stay in the business, right? But they are required to stay in the business to continue to have the claim, right? The moment ITQ came, what did they do? They sold the right? The piece of paper that says 25% of fish is yours in this area, I can take that piece of paper and give it to somebody else. That person can then collect the fish from that area, right? So many of them actually sold their fish, right? Just like you can sell your land, it's very similar if you think about it, right? They also sold the fish, and then many of them started music bands, right? So that's interesting. Huh?
We have similar example in India.
Hmm.
Chilka Lake.
Oh, yeah, the way it is being managed by community, you mean? Yeah. So ITQ is a solution to this particular problem, right? So there are various ways. Now you can see that there are different ways in which we are trying to solve the problem of communitizing collective property, right? And that requires, of course, more nuance in understanding the local situation, figuring out how to allocate the property rights, how to enforce them, how to monitor them, right? So there's a lot of issues involved. At least in theory, in principle, you can see how one can move away from collective ownership to community ownership, right? And be able to solve some of the problems of externality that we are concerned about.
Is the law, so I mean, it doesn't fully remove a state intervention. When you're saying legally entitled to quota sticks, somebody has to enforce it.
Yes. But just like any market, we talked about property right, definite property rights is important for any market to function, right? So unless I know what is mine, what is yours, is difficult to do the transaction. So that role for the state remains, the defining property rights and enforcing them. Though of course there are historical examples how it can be done without the state, but that's a separate issue one can debate, right? But yes, that role does remain, right? So 3 things we talked about, right? Property rights, prices to be free to change, and profit and loss discipline.
I had read that the Project Tiger, which is deemed to be such a big success, that since the national, it was nationalized, that there were so many national parks.
You should look at the numbers.
Tiger conservation has increased, but I have also read that if there was a community kind of conservation effort, community-based conservation effort, then we'd have seen even larger, more number of a greater percentage increase in tigers. Like we have 10,000 tigers in India. was not on national level. Project Tiger was on national level.
So-
Project Tiger isn't such a big success as it is deemed to be.
So I think what we are trying to say that is that there are different ways in which you can solve the problem in a more sustainable long-term manner, right? So Project Tiger is a sort of temporary measure in a way in which, so basically what many of these projects end up doing is giving more guns and guards, right? So the argument is that there are poachers are in large numbers, they have better guns, they can run faster, right? So most of these projects around the world, not just in India, Project Tiger, right, usually are about putting more guards in the forest and giving them bigger guns, right? So they can outrun and outlast the poachers. Those techniques have not really delivered long-term result, right? So I think that's what we have been doing, right? The command and control approach that we talked about. Good question. So what do you think is the approach?
Community-based conservation.
Yeah, what we talked about in the case of Zimbabwe. So something along those lines would have to be done, where you make the community actual owner, right, of the resource.
Forest rights are.
Yeah. But that's only rights are about accessing the forest produce largely. Right? It's not giving the forest to the community. So we had a joint forest management JFM in India. Many countries have done many variations of this idea without actually getting all the way there, right? So parcel control is given, access to forest produce is given to communities in exchange for they becoming the protectors of the forest, right? It works for some time, doesn't work for the long run, right? So there are many examples of this kind across the world, right? Which is not full ownership, right? But partial engagement of some kind of the other. And most of them don't work out in the long run. So 3 textbook solutions to the externalities. One is, of course, command and control. We talked about that. Second is the gap between the private costs and social costs. You can put a tax or subsidy equal to that gap, and thereby you could also make the private cost equal to social cost, right? The third is the cost theorem, which basically says that if property rights are properly defined or clearly defined, right, and the transaction costs are lower, the negotiation between the parties would solve the problem, right? And I was showing you, in a sense, indirectly examples of this kind, where you actually define the property rights from collective property to community property, and thereby being able to solve that problem. So for externalities, right, there's a way in which one can address those problems even through the not purely market mechanism. Here you have community ownership of resources, right? The example that I have used. But at least in that sense, you can see that one could address these challenges without directly be dependent on the state. Ten minutes, 5 minutes. Oh.
You can take 10 minutes.
We can, I think this one probably. So asymmetric information. What's the problem here? Why is market failing?
We don't know what the other side, what are the flaws of when selling a, suppose we are selling a car. So the car, what problem has, I know it. If I'm selling it to you, you don't know it. So that is an asymmetric information. What problem does it have?
Right. So there's a classic example in, of course, market for lemon, which is how is being articulated. But what general problem is that in a market system, the people who consume things have a low amount of information than the other side with whom they are transacting. I know less about diseases than the doctor to whom I go to. There's a huge asymmetry of information between me as a patient and my doctor, right? And the same applies to almost everything. And people see this as a market failure because it's assumed that market would requires perfect information, right? And we'll talk about that a little later on, the assumptions of pure competition, right? My argument is that the asymmetric information is actually a feature of a market economy, right? The more the division of labor and higher the specialization, the higher the degree of asymmetric information, right? And you will see that happening almost everything we consume. We have no idea how any of those things are made, right? In the old days, when you're producing your own goods, you knew exactly how you produce those goods, right? The moment you get into more market transactions, right, you will have less and less knowledge of things you are consuming. Your knowledge of one thing that you are doing, right? So you have expert in one area, right, through which you are able to earn a living, but everything else that you consume, you have largely no idea, right? And the classic example, I'm sure somebody talked about the eye pencil, right? How a pencil is made, yeah.
What is the feature in instances of insider trading? So, asymmetric information is the most solid reasoning used to justify having many layers of laws and layers of compliances that prevent insider trading. But is there a view which says that may not be necessarily a bad idea to have people trade with information which is known only to them before others get to know them? Or is this one of those exceptions which really is a failure?
I think by now you know that there is always going to be somebody who has argued against it, right? So, but you can see how, oh, you can see how one can argue, and this is an argument that large generally being made, I won't go into detail, but that you can solve that problem by employee contracts. So if your employee is going to be trading on insider information because he or she is part of the particular negotiation that's happening, the companies have interest in protecting their own reputation and thereby preventing employees from benefiting, right? So one argument is that you can easily solve the problem by employment contract as opposed to relying on regular. It's a very old argument. Yeah.
Just a small thing, not
Yeah.
any equal point, but I think the problem is not what is counted as failure is not that there is asymmetric information, but that it can be misused. So, so, so when that gap in information can be misused because your doctor knows more, maybe they'll come up with a long prescription. Of, so that's where the failure comes in, right?
I asked the same question to Brian about insider trading. What's the case for it? And except the employment part, he said it shouldn't be a problem. He's like, oh.
But drug regulation is something I cannot wrap my head around.
What
Drug
You're saying drugs
regulation.
shouldn't be regulated?
No, I'm saying it has to. I don't know a way around where you don't have a regulation for quality of drugs, which can lead to death.
So
When you say drug, you mean pharmaceuticals, not marijuana.
No,
Yeah.
So all of this problem.
Okay. Okay.
No, no, no. But what I'm saying is that all of this problem is actually a feature because then it leads to market innovation and brands, right? And that's why market reputation comes about only because there is asymmetric information. Only because when say a particular brand is great and it's offering products that people can trust, that brand would not want to break that trust, and that's one way of solving it. The other way actually asymmetric information gets solved in the modern economy is platforms like Zomato, older days Yelp, and all of that stuff.
Yeah. There are many different platforms that have come up, right?
Maybe one reason for insider trading could be that managers are benefiting at the expense of the shareholder.
Sorry.
Maybe one reason for insider trading could be that managers or employees are benefiting at the expense of the shareholder. The shareholder is losing out, and the manager by winning, or the insider by doing the insider trading is benefiting, but the general public or the shareholder is losing out.
Yeah. I'm not debating the insider trading right now. We have only a few minutes left. but we can talk about over coffee or lunch. So the idea is that market provides information intermediaries, right? So there is of course asymmetric information which is there, but market addresses that also in his own way, right? And you can see multiple ways in which those intermediaries play a role in making sure that the asymmetric information is not that harmful or damaging to the consumer, right? So I'm not going to go into details, but you can see, I think, let me talk about one. UL is an underwriter's laboratory, right? You will see that electrical appliances that you have, most of them would have UL stamp on it, and that means that they have been approved by this particular laboratory, right? So it's not a government institution, it's a private institution, right? And people get certified by them, right? Similarly, there are many different mechanisms created through which, including obviously we have now, on Uber, rating and ranking of various services and things you consume, which also gives information to the third party about quality of the service or the good they are likely to buy, right? The list of things through which, I think I should mention at least one before I close. Holiday Inn, right? It's a franchise business, right? Holiday Inn is a brand, right? The company owns the brand. They don't own the hotels which are run under the brand, right? Now, company has to maintain its own reputation, right? Because when you walk in Holiday Inn, they want to make sure that your experience is very similar to whichever Holiday Inn you walk into around the world, right? So ask yourself, how does a company, the corporation would make sure that the Holiday Inn in Bhubaneswar is producing the very similar quality service as the Holiday Inn in Bangalore, right, or Barcelona. And they have this thick contract, right? And the contract specifies in minute detail, right, the thread count of the bed sheet that you must provide, right? The quality of soap that you must have, right? And I'm sure there are movies made on this. There are people who go, right, visit these hotels anonymously and then check the service quality, right? And make sure, right, random check that. And it turns out the Holiday Inn has more inspectors who go around the world checking quality of your bed sheet and soap. Then there are inspectors on the payroll of FDA, right? Food and Drug Administration, which is in charge of all the food supplies in the US, all the pharma, right? That means slaughterhouses to fast food, everything is being supervised by them, right? They have fewer inspectors on the payroll than just one private company, Holiday Inn. They have more people going around checking the quality of service you get in the Holiday Inn, right? So I think that gives an way of thinking about the regulation is not always by the government, right? Much of the regulation that actually does work for us is done by the private entities themselves, right? So Holiday Inn Corporation, to maintain its reputation, created that kind of long contract, and they of course find ways to enforce the contract on the franchisee, right? And that really is a regulation, right? And that's also regulation. It's a privately produced regulation for private use, right? And so there are many examples of those kinds. Okay, I'm going to skip this completely. Market power, the last, right? Monopolies and oligopolies, which are seen as a common theme of the market. Let me stop here. I know we have things getting delayed, but we can talk about that over lunch later on. Yeah, thank you.